Life. Chapter 5. Barntard Forest Monastery belonged to the Dhamma sect of the Thai monastic order. Dhamma had its beginnings in 1833 as a reform movement that placed greater emphasis on the monastic discipline and the meditation practices found in the original Pali texts. It held monks to a strict interpretation of their monastic obligations, intending to restore proper orthodox practices in the Thai Sangha. In its push to institute strict compliance with the rules, the Dhamma movement was eventually recognized as a separate sect, or Nikaya. The original Thai monastic order from which Dhamma separated became known as the Mahanikaya. This was the sect under which Tan Panya had originally ordained, and to which he still belonged. Ajahn Mahabua was gladly willing to teach Mahanikaya monks like Tan Panya, but insisted that they fully observe the Vinaya while studying with him. He also strictly observed the Dhamma directive not to include Mahanikaya monks in the Patimokkha recitation, which was a formal monastic meeting and thus was limited to the members of the same denomination. That restriction applied to Tan Panya, who was prohibited from taking part in the formal recitation of the monastic rules. Once it became apparent that Tan Panya's temporary residence would, in fact, be a long-term one, Ajahn Mahabua preferred to see him become a full member of his monastic community. Upon his teacher's request, Tan Panya decided to formally ask for a second ordination in the Dhamma sect. Although he was not obliged to part with his monastic robes to achieve that status, he was required to relinquish the 9 years of seniority that he had accrued as a Mahanikaya monk. As a newly ordained Dhamma monk, he would start afresh at the most junior level. Tan Panya travelled to Bangkok together with his teacher and reordained in the Dhamma Nikaya on April 22, 1965 at Bhawanawait Monastery, the very same temple where he had first met Ajahn Mahabua 3 years earlier. Somdet Nyana Sangwara, abbot of Bhawanawait Monastery, presided over his ordination ceremony as preceptor. His chanting instructor was Pratap Nyana Kawi, and his teaching instructor was Ajahn Mahabua. Ordained with him in the same ceremony was a young Canadian who had lived as a novice at Barntard Forest Monastery for the past year. Tan Panya returned from Bangkok a monk of junior rank, but now a full member of his monastic community. Because he had been a member in good standing of the community for so long, his monastic routine changed little. Normally, junior monks were expected to undertake the most basic duties and perform them with energy and humility. But because of his age, at 39, Tan Panya was a decade or two older than most of the other junior monks, and his educational background, his responsibilities evolved over time to include more sophisticated tasks, dealing with the practical application of engineering principles. He soon found himself drawn into a lengthy and arduous undertaking. In recent years, the local villagers had been clear-cutting the forest closer and closer to the edges of the monastery's property. As there was no established boundary line, Ajahn Mahabua was concerned that they might inadvertently encroach upon monastery land. In order to safeguard against unwelcome intrusions, Ajahn Mahabua determined that the exact location of the boundary line should be fixed, and a perimeter fence erected along its full length. He enlisted Tan Panya's help to supervise the project. Although Tan Panya understood the principles involved in land surveying and knew the types of instruments required, he himself had never performed that type of work before. Living in the forest without access to standard technology, he would have to improvise. First, he took a few monks with him to walk the perimeter of the monastery, at least 3/4 of which was densely overgrown. With machete-wielding villagers leading the way, 4 hours were needed to trek around the 1.5-mile-long perimeter. Tan Panya remarked dryly that he felt like H.M. Stanley plunging through the impenetrable African jungles. Although his foot ached from the strain, and he felt frustrated at times with the inconvenience of the workload, he exhibited a calm acceptance of everything that came his way. From a source of inner quiet, he understood that faith in his teacher meant that he must accept without objections, that he must agree to undertake the project, no matter how difficult it might seem. Should he be told to do something he had never before attempted, he must never, under any circumstances, refuse to accept the challenge. Instead, all of his concentrated effort must be dedicated to the task, no matter how much time it took. With a firm belief in the teacher and the training, he carefully worked up a plan and executed it himself, without complacency or complaint. Many people shunned activities that aroused adversity, but Panya refused to regard such work as a hardship. To properly ascertain the shape of the monastery and record those features on a map for future reference, he painstakingly constructed from his limited stock of materials a conventional surveying instrument with a rotating telescope that measured horizontal and vertical angles. Once the device was assembled to his exacting specifications, he proceeded to survey the boundary. It was a laborious undertaking that took many weeks in the dense forest and tangled vegetation. With the survey map as a guide, post holes were dug at intervals, and a sturdy fence was erected around the monastery's perimeter. With the boundary fence completed, an additional project came his way. The nuns who lived in the monastery's kitchen compound were in urgent need of a new pavilion. He was feeling exhausted, and his foot swelled menacingly from too much standing, but he patiently resolved to accept the added burden with a smile. In sincere and hearty appreciation for his teacher's liberating wisdom, he would carry every assignment through without complaint. The original pavilion in the nuns' quarters had been constructed by splitting sections of bamboo lengthwise, spreading them out flat, and securing them to a bamboo frame suspended from tall posts and covered with a thatched roof. The thatch was now so mouldy from dampness and the bamboo so weak from termite damage that it was ready to fall down under its own weight. Panya employed his draftsman's skills to draw up plans for a new structure to take its place. Unlike its predecessor, the new pavilion was large and massively strong. A broad hardwood floor supported by 29 great hardwood posts mounted atop concrete blocks. The corrugated tin roof covering the entire structure looked out of place in that sylvan environment, but it would cut down mightily on future repair work. Most of the monks in the monastery also lived in simple quarters of bamboo platforms with thatched roofs. Cloth curtains hung between the posts to serve as walls. One such platform was constructed for each monk, and each platform was spaced far enough apart from the others to afford adequate privacy. The thick foliage between each platform acted as a natural screen. Local villagers helped to clear a walking meditation track alongside each platform. There the monks practiced walking meditation, often for many hours each day. Standing erect and alert with hands joined just below the waist, they would pace from one end of the path to the other in quiet contemplation. A series of foot trails connected the monks' simple dwellings to one another and to the main meeting hall or sala. The sala was a plain building, an open-walled post and beam structure that served as the main center for group activities. It was the setting for a variety of monastic functions. Every morning the monks gathered under its roof to eat their one daily meal. The monks congregated in that space to listen to the teacher's instructions, and monks and lay devotees used the room for special religious ceremonies. Built of hardwood, the sala was a rectangular building, raised above the ground on wooden posts to a height of 5 feet. The floor, also made of hardwood and highly polished, was constructed in 3 levels. The Buddha image illuminated the hall from a broad raised platform at the back of the building. The area immediately surrounding the sala was swept immaculately clean each afternoon and kept clear of vegetation. The most anticipated gatherings in the sala were Ajahn Mahabua's evening Dhamma talks, delivered spontaneously to a full assembly of monks and novices. These monastic gatherings were unscheduled and unannounced beforehand. On these occasions, Ajahn Mahabua strode from his kuti to the sala at dusk and informed the duty monk that a sangha meeting would convene before dark. What ensued then was a race against time, as the duty monk dashed through the forest, spreading the word to every corner of the monastery. All of the resident monks were expected to be formally robed and seated before their teacher ascended the sala steps at the appointed time, and took his place at the head of the assembly. By 1968, the audience included a number of Westerners who had joined the Sangha at Bantad Forest Monastery since Tan Panya's arrival. Because their Thai language skills were limited, Ajahn Mahabua requested that Tan Panya translate his talks into English for the group. He presented the gist of a discourse from memory immediately after his teacher finished speaking. Since the discourses often lasted well over an hour, he was usually only able to remember the highlights. Though not entirely satisfactory, he tried his best to convey the most important aspects of the night's teachings. By that time, he had been offered a new model cassette tape recorder, which was lightweight and easy to carry. With that small device in hand, he religiously recorded every Dhamma exposition received by the monks in those evening sessions, recordings which could later be reviewed for a more thorough rendering. Monks and lay people intent on the practice have always been inspired to study the words of the great teachers. Tan Panya's recordings of Ajahn Mahabua's discourses would come to be an invaluable resource. Tan Panya took on the task of making formal English translations of many of those talks, with the hope that Ajahn Mahabua's Western students could benefit from their teacher's skillful guidance and uncover the true nature of their own minds. He worked tirelessly, turning transcriptions of his teacher's talks into clear English, bringing Ajahn Mahabua's Dhamma talks to his fellow monks, as well as to a wider Western readership. Ajahn Mahabua had never been a dogmatic teacher. He always stressed that one had to discover the truth for oneself, rather than merely relying on a learned explanation. He used words, ultimately, to direct people inward toward their own minds. When listening to the Dharma, he often emphasized, one's primary focus should be on one's own mind and not on the teacher's words. If you wish to truly experience a place, you do not just read about it. You must step onto the path and travel there. In the same way, the practice of Dhamma is all about walking the noble path. Upon completion of the nuns' pavilion, and with the hot season fast approaching, Tan Panya sought to advance another step along that noble path. He paid his respects to Ajahn Mahabua and asked permission to move to another monastery for several months in order to deepen his commitment to the practice. Permission kindly granted, he set out one April morning for Khao Chin Lam Monastery, to the south in Lopburi province. He rode the slow day train to the end of the line, reaching the monastery just as dusk descended. Limestone caves dotted the hills surrounding Khao Chin Lam Monastery. The caves were silent and comfortably cool in the extreme subtropical heat. For the first 6 weeks, Tan Panya spent much of his time underground, until the start of the monsoon season, when the downpours rendered the underground grottos uncomfortably damp. Most of the caves were so dark during the daylight hours that he needed candles and torches to move about. These large, dark caverns possessed a strange and eerie quality that elicited feelings of vastness, emptiness, and deep silence. Timelessness occupied Tan Panya's mind as he contemplated amidst the ancient stones. Many of the rocks still held fossils from the epoch when that plateau lay beneath the sea, a humbling thought conducive to introspection. Reminded again that life is short and the time of death uncertain, he diligently applied himself to his meditation. The silent stillness of the caves lifted Tan Panya's whole being to a natural and dynamic state of rest, calm and concentration, freeing his mind to pose probing questions and search within for fresh discoveries. He kept probing. What forces come into play at the heart of the human condition? Simply by being born on Earth, people assume they are knowledgeable about the world around them. Human beings inhabit physical bodies composed of the same sort of stuff as rock and mud, wood and water. They share a belief that those material substances are ultimately real, that the physical realm is the world's sum total of what exists. Reflecting on common materialistic views, he reasoned that such notions are programmed into human beings by the circumstances of their upbringing. Because our earliest experiences in life consist of material things in our immediate environment, it is hardly surprising that those objects should be considered real. The Buddha called such firmly held beliefs sammuti, or supposition. Everyone supposes that their view of the world is true. They assume that the information their senses convey about the world around them represents a true picture of reality. They suppose all that, but they do not know it. Their confidence in these suppositions is largely based on the fact that everyone else supposes the same worldview, giving them no reason to seriously question that view's validity. Reflecting that knowledge of the world comes through the five senses, Ajahn Panya probed deeply into how the senses function. What occurred when he saw, heard, smelled, tasted, or touched something? What did sights, sounds, odors, flavors, and touches tell him about the objects that he perceived? If everything he knew about the external world came to him through his senses, did the world out there exist apart from those sensations? Incoming sensations were recognized and interpreted by the mind, meaning that the perception of external objects actually arose in the mind. The incoming sense data reflected the object, but the sense data were not the same as the object. The sense organs picked up light and color, waves and chemicals, heat and pressure, not the objects themselves. Color and shape were filtered through memory to seek images from the mind's database of previous experience in order to recognize and interpret incoming sense impressions, and thus place them in context. He reached the conclusion that he had no means of directly knowing an object in the world as distinguished from the colors and shapes that arose in his field of vision. Because of that, he did not really know the outside world at all. What he knew was the world inside his mind. In other words, the mind knew only the effects caused by incoming sense impressions, and the perceptions based on that knowledge composed the entire world of his experience. Ajahn Panya was convinced that memory was the linchpin in the cog that maintained coherence in the process of perception. He saw that memory is a key component of thinking and imagination, and by extension, of a person's perceived place in the world. Visual and audible objects reveal their identity only when compared to impressions stored in memory. The names and shapes and forms given to things depend on the stored images accumulated in memory, which constantly bring up analogies to previous experience. Without that recognition and process of association, thought, speech, and action would be incoherent. Sense contact triggers pleasant and unpleasant feelings, but memory defines the distinctive quality of those feelings. Feelings arise based on contact with forms, sounds, odors, flavors, or tactile sensations. Memory then tests the effects against past experience, resulting in a reaction. When they compare favorably, the feeling is embraced as pleasant. When they compare unfavorably, it is rejected as unpleasant. The sense object evokes a desirable or an undesirable emotion accordingly. Liking and disliking are the two sides of craving, and craving causes the suffering that keeps living beings bound to the great cycle of repeated birth and death. Ajahn Panya concluded that the interplay between the senses, memory, and feeling is an important dynamic playing out at the heart of the human condition, one that needs unraveling to reach the end of suffering. Everything in the world is seen as it is because living beings have repeatedly solidified their experience of inner and outer reality in the same way, lifetime after lifetime. That continuity of experience leads to the mistaken assumption that what they perceive is objectively real. As Ajahn Panya progressed further along the Buddha's path, he learned how to work directly with such habitual perceptions. As his old concepts of the world gradually dissolved, a wholly new realm of perception started to open up. The role memory played in perception was crucial, that appeared obvious to him. He was puzzled why English translations of the Pali texts never mentioned memory. When he read Thai language translations of the same Pali texts, the mental aggregate, sanya, was clearly referred to as memory. In English translations, the same word was invariably rendered as perception. Although he saw the general reasoning behind that interpretation, He believed it overlooked the specific function of memory in the overall picture of perception. The true meaning of Sanyakanda would be much better served by the translation aggregate of memory. In general, Tan Panya viewed many of the widely accepted translations of Pali terms as artifacts handed down from early 20th century scholars who pioneered the translation of Pali texts into Western languages. Those early interpretations of the original Pali had gone largely unchallenged. They were supposed to be correct because they came from a venerable and authoritative source. Certainly in some cases, a revision was in order. He did not hold scholastic orthodoxy to be sacrosanct. Traditional interpretations should always be examined in the light of direct experience. Tan Panya returned to Bantad Forest Monastery, refreshed and reinvigorated just in time for the rainy season retreat. He resumed his duties, helping the Western monks and lay people who came to train there. The number of Western monks had grown to 6, 3 English, 2 Americans, and a Canadian. Tan Panya continued to translate Ajahn Mahabua's spoken discourses for them, at the same time working on written translations of some of his teachers' more salient Dhamma talks. When the 1972 Rains retreat ended, Ajahn Mahabua requested Tan Panya's assistance on another project. He asked him to design and oversee the construction of a new monk's residence. He envisioned a hardwood structure of spacious proportions containing a single room with an L-shaped veranda that connected to a bathroom. Stout posts supported the entire building 4 feet above the ground. Tan Panya drafted the design and set to work, aided by several of his fellow monks and a few carpenters from the village. As the plans were his, he had to be present the whole time to make sure everything was done properly, which meant that he had virtually no spare time. The project was already half completed when he heard a rumor that the kuti, being built with such attention to detail, was actually intended for him. Ajahn Mahabua had yet to mention it publicly, but Tan Panya was pleased by the prospect because he felt that the site was one of the best locations in the monastery. The surrounding clumps of tangled bamboo effectively screened off the kuti from the rest of the monastery, giving the occupant a satisfying sense of seclusion. As was rumored, upon completion of the kuti, Ajahn Mahabua gave the word for Tan Panya to move in. He would reside in that kuti for the rest of his life. By the early 70s, an increasing number of Westerners, both monks and laypeople, were drawn to the Thai forest tradition, and many of them found their way to Bantad Forest Monastery. Through association with Tan Panya, Ajahn Mahabua was gaining notability among English Buddhists in particular. Some intrepid practitioners even journeyed all the way from England to do retreats at the monastery. Tan Panya felt a special responsibility to introduce them to the practices of the Thai forest tradition, which had reintroduced the ancient standards of Buddhist practice into contemporary monastic life. Accordingly, Tan Panya familiarized them with the fundamentals of forest living, moral discipline, and meditation as supporting principles in their search on the Buddha's path to enlightenment. Since the Buddha's time, monks have retreated into the depths of forests and mountains, seeking physical isolation to help them develop their meditation practices, so as to realize the truth to which the Buddha's teachings point. They lived a life of simplicity, austerity, and dedication. The forests and mountains became the practitioners' equivalent of academies of higher learning, where monks, thoroughly trained in the Dhamma, dedicated themselves to becoming a living expression of the Buddha's teachings, thus making those teachings their own. Because that period of independent study was carried out in the solitude of the forest, the Dhamma they realized in their hearts and shared with their disciples came to be known as Forest Dhamma. That ancient pathway was pristinely exemplified by forest teachers such as Ajahn Mahabua, whose mode of practice emphasized the union of discipline and wisdom to forge a powerful medium for achieving the goals of Buddhist practice. While pointing to the ineffable mysteries of the mind's pure essence, his teachings also gave his disciples down-to-earth, practical methods that guided them at every stage of the path. up to the highest goals of Buddhist meditation. To capture the unique forest spirit of Ajahn Mahabua's Dhamma and spread it throughout the English-speaking world, Ajahn Panya spent several years translating his teacher's recorded discourses. He put together a collection consisting of a select number of talks. When Ajahn Panya finished translating a talk to be included in the collection, he would send the manuscript to England, where his supporters at the Hampshire Buddhist Society published it for free distribution. At first, the talks were published serially, as individual booklets. In 1972, all 5 talks, plus his earlier translation of Wisdom Develops Samadhi, were published in a single volume entitled Forest Dhamma. Ajahn Panya received much encouragement and many invitations from Buddhists in England. Individuals and Buddhist organizations asked him on several occasions to return to England to establish a proper Sangha community. In attempts to persuade him, they offered all manner of huts, cabins, and rural farm retreats for his use. He received many interesting offers, and he weighed each of them with measured caution. Although he was always willing to discuss the possibilities, he was never quite satisfied with the long-term prospects of these generous proposals. He had not made a firm commitment to spending the rest of his life in Thailand, yet he felt a deep reluctance to abandon the security of his teacher for uncertain prospects back in his home country. Surely the cool climate of the English countryside was more favourable, and the living conditions more to his liking. But those were not valid reasons to forsake such favourable conditions for his training and return home. He saw no purpose in returning to England without having first completed the training and gained a rock-solid footing in the Dhamma. He saw that those who ordained in the East, training with a teacher only briefly before returning to the West, were invariably overwhelmed by the situation and came to naught as teachers. Perhaps one day his mental fortitude would be firm enough to return. Until then, he would not take the risk. Ajahn Panya's potential sponsors were content to have him return to England alone to spread the Dhamma, but he was not confident enough in the fruits of his practice to seriously consider taking on that responsibility. He did, however, have a strong desire to bring the true Dharma to those back in his home country. He hoped, therefore, to accompany Ajahn Mahabua to England, so that the Buddhist community could benefit from the rare opportunity to meet and listen to a monk of such exalted attainment. His teacher's persistence in studying English fortified Ajahn Panya's belief in his teacher's willingness to make the long trip westward. By 1972, the Dhammapadippa Vihara at Haverstock Hill, also known as Hampstead Vihara, which operated under the auspices of the English Sangha Trust, was experiencing a shortage of resident monks. Since the charter of the English Sangha Trust expressly acknowledged its mission as being to support the Bhikkhu Sangha, a concerted effort began to find an English monk capable of fulfilling that role. Having had limited success at home, the directors of the English Sangha Trust decided in early 1974 to invite Ajahn Mahabua to England for a visit, along with the monk they still remembered as Bhikkhu Panyavaddho. The directors of the trust maintained the hope that Ajahn Mahabua would allow his English disciple to remain in England as the new incumbent at the Dhammapadippa Vihara. On June 8, 1974, Ajahn Mahabua stepped off the plane in London, accompanied by Ajahn Panya and Ajahn Abhichetto, the Canadian monk who had ordained with him 9 years earlier. All 3 accepted accommodations at Dhammapadippa Vihara. As was the custom at their monastery in Thailand, the monks ate 1 meal a day early each morning, during which time public attendance was always welcome. Having received generous offerings of food and eaten the meal simply and without ceremony, Ajahn Mahabua gave a brief talk on Dhamma practice, which was often followed by a lengthy question and answer session. Ajahn Panya acted as his teacher's official translator for the entire visit. Each evening, Ajahn Mahabua delivered a discourse, followed by another question and answer session with those in attendance. Prominent members of the Buddhist scene in England, such as Christmas Humphreys and Maurice Walsh, came to pay their respects to this renowned teacher from the Thai forest tradition, as did scores of Buddhist lay followers. The talks they heard were thought-provoking and inspiring. In deference to his teacher, Ajahn Panya refrained from giving formal Dhamma talks, but he did make himself available to answer questions on practice. For the most part, the visiting monks kept to that same schedule throughout the 2 weeks of their stay at the Dhammapadipa Vihara. As their departure for Thailand drew near, the directors of the English Sangha Trust approached Ajahn Mahabua and requested him to allow Bhikkhu Panyavaddho to remain in England as a teacher, for the purpose of establishing an English Sangha in the United Kingdom. Ajahn Mahabua replied that in order to teach others, one must first clearly know the Dhamma for oneself. For the most part, he considered that those who had yet to see the true nature of Dhamma were unqualified to speak about it in front of other people. For that reason, he felt that Ajahn Panya was not yet ready to assume the responsibility of a teacher. He did state, however, that it would not be long before the circumstances were ripe for the establishment of a properly qualified Bhikkhu Sangha in England. With that parting assurance, the visitors boarded a plane on June 22nd for their return to Thailand. 2 years later, still diligently attempting to establish the Sangha in England, representatives of the English Sangha Trust travelled to Thailand. They intended to beseech Ajahn Mahabua once again to sanction Ajahn Panya's return to England, to become a mainstay for the English Sangha. When Ajahn Mahabua refused a second time, they proceeded to Ajahn Chah's forest monastery in Ubon Ratchathani and begged for his kind assistance. The result of that request marks the beginning of the story of the English Sangha, which has continued wholeheartedly up to the present day. After returning from England, Ajahn Panya resumed in earnest the spiritual training that was his life's work. He was now 48 years old. In training the mind, the first requirement is to see directly and concretely how different aspects of the mind function in relation to the whole. By reflecting on the knowledge that he derived from listening to Ajahn Mahabua's teachings and combining that with his personal meditation experience, Ajahn Panya probed ever more deeply into the nature of the mind itself. Working skillfully with mindfulness and wisdom, the focus of his awareness sharpened and became more adaptable to the mind's ever-changing landscape. Ajahn Mahabua referred often to the one who knows, differentiating the knowing mind from the states of mind that arise and cease. Following the Thai vernacular, Ajahn Panya began referring to the knowing mind as the chitta. The chitta represented the very nature of mind, its innermost essence, which is absolutely and always untouched by change or death. The mind's true nature is normally hidden beneath layers of defilements and the mental confusion of thoughts and emotions. Occasionally, Ajahn Panya uncovered glimpses of that essential nature of mind through meditative insight, thus gaining a deeper understanding and a profound sense of freedom. Ajahn Panya realized intuitively the importance of that stable, unchanging essence. It was evident in his practice that mental phenomena came and went, arising and ceasing continually at almost electric speed. If our awareness of these phenomena were to arise and vanish simultaneously at the same speed, there would be no stable platform from which that mental activity could be known or perceived. The mind in its entirety would be nothing more than a chaotic sea of random mental events, with no reliable continuum of awareness to connect them into thoughts, concepts, and emotions. For the mind as a whole to function as it does, that platform must exist independently of all the changing phenomena that constitute mental activity. Transient mental states being the prerogative of the four mental aggregates, feeling, memory, thought, and consciousness, the knowing of them must take place outside of the sphere of their activity. However, Ajahn Panya realized that the knowing nature was not pure or unblemished. It was permeated by corruptive elements, which distorted the view of the knower and the perception of what was known. The Buddha called these corrupting influences kilesas. Because one's knowing was corrupted from within by kilesas, one's knowledge of mental activity could not be trusted or true. Ajahn Panya saw clearly that the real enemy was inside. The creator of trouble, the source of all suffering, the destroyer of joy and virtue existed inside of us. Kilesas had a most slippery and unsettling presence in the mind, and they possessed an air of danger which sometimes seemed more charged and intense than any external threat. The Kilesas were cunning, greedy, hateful, and expert in the games of deception. Under their defiling influence, the chaotic, confused, and undisciplined mind again and again fell victim to death and rebirth. But what was it that died, and what was reborn? Ajahn Panya's investigations returned to the chitta, the innermost essence of mind. If the chitta was the essence of being that wandered from birth to birth, that would explain how the fruits of one's actions were carried along from life to ripen in the future. When corrupted by defilements, the chitta manipulated the body and mind to plant the seeds of wholesome and unwholesome actions. It then reaped pleasure or pain as a consequence. The chitta, in a sense, was the foundation of samsara, the round of repeated birth and death. Without the chitta to create and store karmic actions and their consequences, samsara would have no basis. It could not exist. But though samsara needed the chitta to exist, the chitta did not depend on samsara in any way. The two could be separated by eliminating the cause of samsaric existence from the chitta, freeing it to revert to its pure primordial knowing essence. That cause of continuing samsaric existence was none other than the defiling influence of the kilesas. For that reason, ridding the chitta of the kilesas was the goal of the Buddha's path of practice. Reflections on the supreme goal led Ajahn Panya to contemplate the truth of the term arahant. It was apparent to him that arahant referred to the chitta that had been purified of defilements. The term only applied to a human being by means of that chitta's transient association with a physical form. The mental and physical personality lived on as a result of past karma, but the true arahant, the pure chitta, had no form, no characteristics, and created no karma.